Welcome back to International 110. My name is Mr. Rankin. Today we're going to give you a brief summary of Chapter 3, which talks about culture, ethics, and norms. So let's go down some of the learning objectives and sort of an overview of the chapter. First question was, where do informal institutions come from? Well, they come from the culture, the heritage, the ethics, the norms. One thing the book cautions us about is ethnocentrism, which is a self-centered mentality held by some groups that perceives their own culture as morally right. Number two, culture in two main manifestations. Well, culture is defined as a collective programming of the mind that distinguishes one group from another, and it's manifested in language, different languages, and in different religions. Now, I think this gets very interesting. 3 ways to understand cultural differences. First of all, there's a context approach. Low context countries or nations or cultures, they tend to take what's the spoken word at face value. If I say no, that means no. That's a low context culture. In a high context culture, much more of the communication is relied on the unspoken word. In other words, example might be I think in one of our examples in the Japanese culture, where you know your boss calls you into the office. They may not say anything, but just the fact that they've called you into the office means you've done something probably incorrect. So low context cultures, no means no. What's spoken word is taken at face value. High context cultures rely much more on the unspoken word. The cluster approach is clustering, much like the word says, different cultures into groups and defining those different groups. The last way, and perhaps the most interesting way, is the dimension approach, where they look at dimensions like power distance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, uncertainty avoidance. All these different dimensions define a culture. So power distance would be, an example of that is like the Army, where, authority is very much respected and isn't questioned. Authority is never questioned. In other cultures, it's thought, no, if I don't think what the boss is telling me is correct, I have the right to question that. So in business, people need to understand which culture they're in, because if you go into a culture where it's not expected to disagree with the boss, and you open up for conversation, you won't get a lot of conversation because people will be waiting to hear what the boss says. So those are the 5 dimension approach. So then they talk about cultural differences and the importance to business. Why understanding these cultural differences are important. Well, I think it's because you need to be able to communicate to people effectively if you're operating a business, and you need to gain their trust. And if you don't do those things, then it's going to be hard to manage the business. After we talked about culture, then it moves on to ethics and why ethics, doing the ethical thing, is important. And again, I think this all goes back to trust. Once you gain or lose, if you lose trust, it's very difficult to regain. So I think it's pretty important why ethics are important to a business. So how are you going to combat corruption or people breaking the ethics? Well, they talk about establishing a code of conduct so that employees know where the boundaries are, what is right, what isn't right. A couple of approaches. Ethical relativism means, you do in Rome as the Romans do. Ethical imperialism says there are absolutes. Middle of the road, 3 dimensions that Donaldson presents. Finally, 4 different ways to respond. You can be reactive, defensive, proactive. And then it's important for you as business people to acquire a cross-cultural literacy so that you understand these cultural differences. That's a quick overview of Chapter 3. Any questions? Let me know. Have a good week.